fact, I don't think I've seen a synagogue ever that has bells. I could be wrong though. Somewhere around the world.
Not really a church thing. They just put them in churches, but it's great. I live right next door, so I'm late. I know.
All right, we're live on the screen too.
Okay, well, we are live online and in person, and I want to say welcome. My name is Father Ben Shambaugh. I'm the rector, the priest here at St. Luke's Episcopal Church. And how many of you have never been in this space before? Well, we want to say welcome. This is just a pleasure. There's a long history of doing things with the Jewish Center of the Hamptons and conversations like this. Rabbi Josh Franklin and I did this last year, and it was just a lot of fun. It was wonderful to explore our commonalities and our differences together. And we have become good friends in this process and just enjoy putting our thoughts and our hearts together and sharing what's so meaningful to all of us. We're going to have a back and forth conversation. At the end, we're going to have time for conversation and questions. And then, as I said, after this is over, we will have coffee and some refreshments in Hoy Hall, which is our fellowship hall just out through these doors. And you can have more conversation at that time as well. The first two sessions this week and next are here at St. Luke's, and the next two sessions are at the Jewish Center of the Hamptons. You do need to register. Now, St. Luke's people are not necessarily used to this, but you do need to register so you could be on the list when you go into the Jewish Center of the Hamptons for security reasons. So we really appreciate that and appreciate you being here.
And we're looking forward to welcoming everyone who hasn't been to the Jewish Center of the Hamptons yet. Let me try a similar thing. How many of you have not been to the Jewish Center of the Hamptons ever? Okay, it's actually probably about an equal number.
Hey, you're in for a treat.
I think you are, indeed.
You are.
And even this class, I'm in for a treat. I always love learning with you.
We enjoy just building off each other. I want to give a brief introduction to this building, to this space, because you may not have been here before. St. Luke's is an Episcopal church, and we are part of what's called the Episcopal Diocese of Long Island, if you think of Long Island itself and all the Episcopal churches in Long Island. There was a congregation here in the 1850s, but this building was built in 1909, and it was built after the design of an English parish church in Maidstone, England. As you know, Maidstone was the first name of East Hampton. And so it was designed to look like a 12th century neo-Gothic country church in England. So that's the arches, the woodwork, the carvings, all of that is meant to evoke that kind of theme.
Looks just like the Jewish Center of the Hamptons.
It sure does. So anyway, so welcome, and we can talk much more about the history of the place. We have our historian is actually here with us today. If you're interested in that, or in the stained glass or anything like that, our architecture is older, yours is modern, and it's wonderful to have both here. Why don't we just dive in? Josh, can you tell us a little bit about what got us going on the 10 Commandments?
Yeah, well, we should start with the whole frame of what we're doing here. Last time we got to hang out with you guys, we started looking at different texts from our traditions that conveyed similar ideas to show how alike we actually are, and we're probably more alike than we are different in most ways. It's part of the reasons why we can actually be friends and get along so well, and why the East Hampton Clericus, we have a couple members of the East Hampton Clericus joining us. We have Reverend Rob Stewart, I see. I think George Dietrich might be joining us virtually as well from the Lutheran Church. We all get along. We're all friendly. We all do things together because there is so much that does unite us. However, and then there's the big however. We pat ourselves on the back so much that we're so alike, and we got to forget about the differences, that we forget that there actually are differences between our traditions, and quite often the differences are substantial. But the other interesting thing about it is that we share a lot of common scripture. We should use some terminology here because we're going to use different terminology. So if I say something that might be a little bit different than you're used to, just understand where I'm coming from. So for example, Ben, I'm going to call you Ben here. Ben, you can call me Josh. you're going to say the Old Testament, and that's our shared scripture, and I'm going to call the Old Testament the Hebrew Bible. Why? Because we don't have a New Testament. It's just the Testament. It's just the Hebrew Bible, and the Hebrew Bible consists of the very same books that are in the Old Testament, though, by the way, a little bit different of an order. So if you pick up an Old Testament and a Hebrew Bible and you're like exactly the same thing, and you flip through the pages to get that to that familiar spot, you'll notice that we have a different order than the New Testament. And then you actually look at the Catholic New Testament, and you'll see that there's some extra books in there as well, like the book of Maccabees, which, by the way, we like as Jews. We actually read the book of Maccabees at certain times to understand our history, particularly around the holiday of Hanukkah. However, it is not in the Hebrew Bible. It's in a book called the Apocrypha, the hidden books. And so we separate those things. Again, a lot of overlap. There are some subtle differences in language. So when you hear me say Hebrew Bible, it means for you Old Testament. And I will refer to the New Testament as the New Testament. But you'll get where I'm coming from.
Well, an interesting piece there, the Apocrypha, which Josh just referred to, and most of, well, the New Testament were actually written in Greek. So Hebrew, you could think of as the language in which it was written, and it was the oral traditions continued. Greek, not Latin, and not Aramaic, which Jesus probably spoke, but Greek was the language in which the New Testament was written. So you might hear me refer to things in Greek the way that Josh refers to, except Josh is much more fluent in Hebrew than I am in Greek. I just took a couple semesters when I had to. Josh has learned Hebrew his whole life, so a little different. But
kind of.
It's helpful to understand some of those sources. And just the way that the rabbis have developed teaching and writings and resources over time, Christian matriarchs and patriarchs have done the same thing. So you hear us refer to our traditions that are not biblical, but they're part of who we are.
Yeah, so I'll refer to things like rabbinic literature, the Mishnah and the Talmud, and that's probably equivalent in the Christian tradition to the early church fathers.
Yeah, and the saints and things like that.
Written all the same time, 1st through 5th century of the Common Era. I mean, that's when Origen and the early church fathers, right? Same kind of era.
And one other vocabulary, he just said the Common Era. This, instead of saying AD and BC, the current norm, it's not just in this dialogue, but in academia, is to use that word, the Common Era and before the Common Era. Same thing as AD and BC, but much more respectful use. So you'll hear the Common Era, for example.
and BCE.
Yeah.
Absolutely. By the way, we acknowledge Jesus. I mean, Jesus was an important figure in the rabbinic time period, and Jesus was well-versed in the rabbinic tradition, and you'll actually see a lot of overlap in what Jesus says and what a lot of the early rabbinic rabbis had to say on certain issues.
So let's dive in.
Yeah, we thought let's go to a text that you all know, but probably are going to realize isn't as important or isn't as well known as you might think it is. And that is the Ten Commandments. Everyone knows the Ten Commandments. Just walk into a courtroom and you might see the Ten Commandments written on the wall. Go to Alabama and you go to the schools there and you might actually see a copy of the Ten Commandments in the classroom. But I would actually ask the question, whose Ten Commandments? You're like, oh, the Ten Commandments are the Ten Commandments, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They're all the same, except for the fact that they're not. By the way, they're not just not the same between Judaism and Christianity. They're not the same between Protestant traditions and Catholicism. The commandments are actually counted differently, believe it or not. And it's not just semantics in terms of a reordering or anything. There's deep theological significance into the way that the commandments are counted. And now here's a big shocker, which I'm just going to explore. We don't actually even call them the Ten Commandments.
What do you call them?
We call them in Hebrew the Aseret HaDibrot, which means the 10 utterances. By the way, this comes directly from the book of Deuteronomy. When you look at Deuteronomy, you have this line, V'yaged lechem et brito asher tziva etchem la'asot aseret ha'devarim. He announced to you his covenant, Moses is saying to the people. God announced to you his covenant, which he commanded you to observe. The 10 dibrot, or divarim, the 10 utterances, they're not referred to as commandments. And commandment number 1, as the Jewish people count it, is not even a commandment at all. Do we have any more? We might be out. You might have to share our copies of the charts that we gave you of the differences between the Jewish, Protestant, and Catholic 10 Commandments. So you probably have those in front of you. And if you're looking at those sheets, you'll see that the way that the Jewish tradition counts the first commandment is Anochi Adonai Elohecha asher hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim mibeit avadim. I, Adonai, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. And your question should be, where's the commandment? And there isn't one. I think there's some distinctions, by the way, and differences between the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church in terms of how commandments 1 or 2 are counted as well. I'd love, Ben, if you can say a little more about that.
You can see this in this chart. I want to tell those of you who are not familiar with Christianity or St. Luke's, I don't represent there's a great diversity of perspective and thought within Christianity. We talk about Catholic and Protestant. The Church of England, the Anglican Church, of which the Episcopal Church grew out of, does not really consider itself Catholic or Protestant. It considers itself Catholic and Reformed, which is to say they kind of blend both. So we're a weird hybrid. Most of what I will share with you from the Episcopal perspective comes from our worship. And one of the things that's important to understand about the 10 Commandments is the 10 Commandments in the Protestant form, on the third column there, were put into the Episcopal prayer book in 1552 and made a requirement in 1552. In 1666, they were a requirement in the Book of Common Prayer. Think of when East Hampton was established, right? So about that time, you had to say them every Sunday. And then as the prayer book evolved, it became an optional addition to our worship. And often it was replaced, the 10 Commandments, with the great commandment to love God and with your heart, soul, mind, love your neighbor as yourself. So interesting, right?
We did the opposite, by the way.
You did.
So what happened in the Jewish tradition is the 10 Commandments were originally a part of our liturgy in the morning worship. If you go to a prayer book today and you open up the prayer book, you're not going to find a copy of the 10 Commandments listed, except in our current prayer book, it's listed as an optional thing to try to reintroduce it. What historically happened was that the 10 Commandments were read exactly before the section of liturgy that you mentioned. Love God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your soul, or in Hebrew, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, which many of you know. And there was a problem. The problem was that if you see these as central 10 Commandments that are the foundation of everything, there's a belief that Jews only have 10 Commandments. And the problem is,
You have 400 and...
we have more. We have 613 commandments. And the question would be, are these 10 commandments any different than the other 603? No, they're not. They're not really all that different at all in terms of their status. You do have people who essentially say that, well, these are the ones that are written on what's called the Luchot HaBrit, the tablets of the covenant, which is what we call the 2 tablets. Notice that key word covenant, which is an important word for understanding the 10 Commandments. By the way, those 2 tablets were eventually put into the Ark of the Covenant, which if you've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, you probably know just a little bit about. So we have covenant and... Oh, I lost my train of thought. Where did we start? What were we talking about? Tablets. Before the tablets. I got to say. Oh, liturgy.
It's liturgy.
We're talking about liturgy. Yeah. So they took it out of the prayer book, lest someone over here, a Jew praying and thinking that they only observe 10 commandments when we really observe 613.
Well, so I have a question for you about that, because when you get to Jesus says, the first commandment, it says, love Lord your God with your heart, soul, and mind, love your neighbors yourself. On these two, the old words were hang all the law and the prophets. The Christian perspective has been, okay, so we live the law of love, and therefore we don't need to obey all the other ones. This is a difference, right? The Council of Jerusalem, which you read about in the book of Acts, which very early in the church history had this decision, right? What do we do about non-Jewish converts to Christianity? Do they need to be circumcised? Do they need to follow Jewish dietary laws? And the Christian church at that time, which is very early, says no, you don't need to, because this commandment to love supersedes all the other commandments. In other words, as the Apostle Paul says, the law was our custodian until Christ came. In other words, once we have Jesus, we don't need all of the laws. But what I hear you saying is that, well, you got 10, but you also have others. So how do you differentiate between like the kosher laws and the Sabbath law?
Well, let's talk about that. You know, certain commandments are probably more important than others, and let's also talk about that. If these are the 10 commandments, the 10 most important commandments, one of the questions we should be asking ourselves is, what's missing? When Jesus is asked, you know, what's the secret to eternal life? In Mark, he lists only 5 of the commandments. He doesn't list Shabbat. He doesn't list the first commandment, you shall have no other gods besides me. He lists, maybe if I have it here, honor your father, your mother, shall not steal. But he only lists 5, and then he says, and love your neighbor as yourself, which isn't one of the 10 commandments. But it is considered by the Jewish tradition what we would call the golden rule, or one of the golden means. In fact, Rabbi Hillel, who's a contemporary of Jesus, says something very similar. Rabbi Akiva as well. They say, you know, this is the most fundamental law of Torah. Learn this and everything else is commentary. Love your neighbor as yourself. So that's a fundamental law, but not a part of the 10 commandments. But then you're going to look and you're going to realize that even if you're looking at the way that the Catholics count the 10 commandments, you'll see that they have 2 separate laws or commandments about coveting. Which is a little strange.
There's a really interesting comment about that. If you look at the middle column of that page, the number 9 and 10, you'll see that the Jewish 9 and the Protestant 9 says don't false witness, right? Catholics slip that above, and then they divide coveting your neighbor's wife with coveting your neighbor's everything else. And the Catholic commentary I read said, well, isn't it different? You know, isn't your neighbor's wife more important than your neighbor's lawnmower? And I thought, well, I guess she is, and she deserves the whole commandment. But, I mean, it is interesting because I think the idea was you had to have 10. We have this in our tradition that there's 10. So what are they? And by the way, then again, if you're going to put them up in a school on the wall, which one?
Let's go to what else is missing, right? You know, the most repeated commandment in the entire Hebrew Bible, or at least the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, most repeated commandment has to do with loving the stranger, which we would probably mutually agree is one of the most important acts that we could have towards the other. It's similar, not necessarily the same as love your neighbor as yourself, but not oppressing the stranger, uplifting those who are oppressed, and it's not in the 10 Commandments. And instead you have at least 1 or 2 things about coveting, which is one of the least enforceable possible commandments that you possibly can enforce. Don't covet? Really?
And a bit of the stranger comes up, I think, in Deuteronomy over the Sabbath. There's a little explanation in there in the text when the 10 Commandments are given. Remember, your slave and everybody else, your foreigner, they have to obey those Sabbath laws too. They're mentioned, but you're right. The stranger entertaining angels, without knowing it. Yeah. It's a huge thing.
Yeah, or other prohibitions that should be there. How about don't rape? I mean, that should be one of the 10 Commandments, I would think. And instead, we have actually not the greatest set of law codes, or the greatest set of great law code, because it's actually missing a great deal. and not highlighting some of the things that are objectively important in other parts of Scripture.
Well, and that brings up the whole idea of the Ten Commandments is the basis for American law.
No way.
And there's a wonderful article from Yeshiva University, a Christian lawyer at Yeshiva University who wrote about this. Yes, her argument is you just start checking them off. How is following the Sabbath rules part of American law? How, honoring your father and your mother is a moral construct, but it doesn't lead to American law. And she just goes down the list. And there's just a few, and even, now don't bear false witness.
Perjury.
Yeah, but it's not, as she said, people actually lie all the time. So is that really the foundation of our society, or is it something else? Is it the Magna Carta? Is it Hammurabi? There's other historical sources much closer to American law. So the idea that we're putting it up because it's the foundation of who we are as a society is very interesting, particularly in America. What about free speech and freedom of religion? So if there's no other God but me, but wait a minute, what if I don't believe in God at all, or it violates our constitutional rights to say there's only one God. So a very interesting article about that.
I think it was Jefferson who used the expression in the early 19th century, like 1802. He wrote a letter and talked about the wall of separation between church and state. And that was the first time the term was ever used. So it was a term that was introduced by our founding fathers, which is distinct from freedom of religion. Mm-hmm. This is really putting that wall that separates government institutions from religious institutions, particularly Christianity at the time. But yeah, I would say at best, if we're looking at this list, and according to her, you have only 3 of the 10 commandments which can have any relation to the foundation of American law. 3, and that is don't kill, don't steal, and don't bear false witness. And don't kill and don't steal are probably taken from the Code of Hammurabi, which is 1,000 years that predates the 10 Commandments as a whole. So it's not necessarily the foundation. It's not the world's first thing that is the foundation of Western law. It really is something different.
But if it is the foundation of Jewish and Christian faith, then my question to you is, so how do you actually live this out? As a culture, if we say it's American culture to honor your father and your mother, what do we do about taking care of seniors? And I'm not just talking about the senior center in East Hampton, right? How do we treat elderly in our society? How do we honor them? You can go down these things. What about the Sabbath? The Sabbath.
We've got a huge difference there.
Jesus trips over the Sabbath all the time. If you read the Christian scriptures, it's the biggest complaint about Jesus from the Jewish authorities is he does stuff on the Sabbath. He heals people on the Sabbath. He helps people on the Sabbath. And everybody kind of gets the idea that in an emergency you could help somebody, but he's doing it all the time.
But notice too, when Jesus is asked, what's the secret to eternal life, and he's listing the commandments, he excludes listing the Sabbath, or we would call Shabbat.
So this is a difference. So as I said, it might not be part of our culture. In fact, we don't always take weekends off. Most of us work on weekends, or we're logged into our work all the time. But what about the Sabbath?
Yeah.
Tell us more about that.
I would tell you that one of the most fundamental commandments to the Jewish tradition is the Sabbath. It's almost the exact opposite for Christianity. Jesus, I'm guessing, is seen that the Sabbath is in many ways fulfilled by the coming of the Messiah. But for Jews, Shabbat, or our Sabbath, is the holiest day of the week. And it's the holiday that is most celebrated because we celebrate it 52 times a year. For us, it's our day of rest, and we take it very seriously. We refrain from doing things that cause stress, that are work, and we really have a high burden that we place on making sure that our community observes Shabbat. For some people, they're more diligent in how they observe Shabbat. In very traditional and very orthodox communities, they won't travel, they won't use electronics, they won't cook, they won't use anything that has to do with fire, they won't rip, they won't tear, they won't sew, they won't create, It's really about abstention from a lot of different things. I like to talk about how Shabbat, for me in particular, is really about the things that you do that help you focus on the most important things in life. What they're really trying to do is remove the things that distract you from focusing on the most important things in life: friends, family, community. So on Shabbat, we gather together. Those are our times of prayer on Friday night and Saturday morning. Shabbat dinner is integral to the Jewish experience. That gathers people and guests around a dinner table on Friday night. There's a great line from a great Jewish thinker. His name is Achad Ha'am. And he said, more than the Jewish people have kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jewish people. It's this idea of Shabbat being a day that really sustains and refreshes us. So and we take it very seriously, and it's paramount among the commandments in terms of what we take as a observance.
Well, you know what I love about what you just said is I love the tradition of a family celebrating Shabbat at home over dinner. And many Jewish traditions are actually celebrated in the home. And we tend to build fancy churches and focus things at church, and we might say a little prayer at dinner or something, but we really don't live out our identity that way at home the way we probably should or could. And I think that's very, very wonderful. One of the things that is interesting is, anybody speak Spanish? What is Saturday in Spanish? Sabbath, right? Same thing in Russian, same thing in a bunch of other languages. Christians have always recognized that Saturday is the Sabbath day. Sunday is the first day of the week. It's the day that Jesus was raised from the dead. For us, you said we celebrate it 52 times a year. For us, every Sunday is a little resurrection. It's a little Easter. And it's the beginning of the week because it's new life, and it's the resurrection. So it's tied into the resurrection, not really the Sabbath. It's the Christian Sabbath, but it was made, though, Sunday, the Christian Sabbath, by Constantine in 321 AD. Just a little history. Constantine was the Roman Empire, became Christian, complicated, but effectively Christianity became the religion of the empire, and he started declaring all kinds of things. One of the things the early Christians did is they Christianized pagan holidays. Christmas, for example, the December 25th, who knows when Jesus was actually born, but it was a Roman holiday that was then Christianized, taken over, and they put Christmas, it doesn't mean that Christmas didn't happen. We don't know the date. You know what I'm saying? So same thing with Sunday. It was actually a Roman celebration of Mithras, of the sun god. We call it Sunday to this very day. But he took it over and said it's about the sun, S-O-N. It's about the resurrection. But it was really about the resurrection, not about Sabbath, right? So the Christian Sabbath became that way. So we're a little bit conflicted. Although I would tell you, in a more traditional Christian sense, I had a father-in-law that if I said to him, "Do you want to work on something together on Sunday?" he'd say no. If I said, "You want to go do something together that's fun?" he would say yes, even if it was the same thing. If it was work, you didn't work on the Sabbath. And, blue laws and things like that. It was all this idea of keeping the Sabbath holy. And we have, as a culture, forgotten that. And as Christians, most of our kids that go, instead of Sunday school, go to soccer, because. So
by the way, if you go to Israel, their weekend looks different than ours. So in Israel, and I've lived in Israel, Friday afternoon is when everything stops because people are getting ready to celebrate Shabbat. So they do all their shopping, they are cooking, they're getting prepped. Schools get out early. Then Saturday is really Shabbat, and Sunday is the beginning of the work week. And they get a shorter weekend, and thus are more productive.
And it's true that the Jewish day begins at sundown the night before, right?
Correct.
So Shabbat begins sundown Friday night.
Yep.
Which, by the way, is the reason that Christmas Eve is on Christmas Eve, because it's really Christmas Day already, right? It's also the excuse to having a Catholic Mass at 5 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, because actually it's Sunday already.
And this goes actually back
You're not skipping ahead.
This goes back to Genesis in terms of how they're counting days. There was evening and there was morning, day one. It says evening first. So therefore evening must begin the day as opposed to morning beginning the day. And that's kept consistent throughout the Jewish calendar. But yeah, I would say the one thing that I feel like you guys missed out on is getting rid of the experience of Shabbat, because it's one of the most enriching pieces of Judaism. The best gift that we have. And Shabbat can go by for many people without, actually being celebrated, in which case it doesn't necessarily happen. You actually have to actively take a role in putting things away and spending your time in a way that actually is enriching and rejuvenating. And it mimics also what we see in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. God stops, Shavat, which means lishbot means to stop, or Shabbat, Vainafash, and God is rejuvenated, but really resouled, not like your shoe, but resouled. And that's what happens to us, I believe, as well on Shabbat. We're resouled, we're rejuvenated, it's generative in terms of its ability to help us think creatively and spiritually. So I wish...
There is a tradition of requiring people to go to Mass, which is to go to our communion service. The Catholic Church will still say that. In fact, a Catholic bishop in Southern California just gave permission for his Latino members to not go to Mass because they were afraid. But it's showing how important it is in that culture to go to Mass. But going to Mass is it's special, but it's not.
A lot of people.
It's like I go for an hour and I check my box, and you're missing the point. I love what you're saying about Shabbat.
Going to a synagogue is one of the things that you would do on Shabbat, but it's not the whole experience itself, which I think it's become.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting.
Yeah,
I think that's really wonderful.
It's really celebrating the holiness of time, not the holiness of space.
Well, I want to go back. You mentioned a little earlier, it's in the Gospel of Mark, and it's actually in Luke too. The story, in Luke, he's called a rich young ruler. In Mark, he's called a rich young man. And he comes running up to Jesus, and he says, "What good teacher," he uses the word rabbi for Jesus, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says to him, "Why do you call me good, first of all? Don't butter me up. No one is good but God alone." Then he says, "You know the commandments." And as Josh just said, he lists some of them, not all of them. And the man says to Jesus, "Teacher, I have observed all of these from my youth." So the next sentence, Jesus looks at him and loves him, and then says to him, "You lack one thing. Go sell what you have and give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me." And it says, and saying that his countenance fell. Another translation says he went away sorrowful because he had great possessions. This is a very interesting dialogue to me, because he goes through the commandments, he gets into loving your neighbor, but then he asks him to apply it. Right? Okay, you're going to do all this, so prove it. Sell what you have. Give it to the poor. Live it out. And then you can follow me. And that the application, I think, is sometimes Christians get into you've got to follow this rule, this rule, this rule, and I'm good. I've checked them all off. Jesus is saying, no. You got to take this stuff and you have to apply it. And so applying the Ten Commandments. I think this is actually what people are thinking when they put them up in front of a courthouse. It's like or a schoolroom. They're going to see these, and kids will say, "Oh yeah, I should not commit adultery." I think most fifth graders are not going to worry about that, or they're going to wonder. But that's what people are thinking. You're going to apply it, and that's where Jesus goes with this. Jesus' response to that is how hard it will be for those who have riches to enter the kingdom of God. It is easier for a camel to enter the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Whew. He's saying it's tough, but he's challenging us to do it, to take these words and apply them all the way down. So kind of interesting, even though we kind of let the Sabbath slide. Maybe not the others.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to certain things which we let slide, because I would say there are other ones too. Don't take God's name in vain, right? I think that's one that even generally, culturally, religiously, slides a little bit. And if so, why is it one of the 10 Commandments?
Can you explain just on that? I noticed that you used the tradition of, in this first one with Jewish, or where it came from, G-D and the dots like on the scrolls. Just describe that to us.
Yeah, there's a tradition that you should never erase God's name. The problem is that God's name is not God, right? Actually, if you look at the text, you'll see in the English it's written L-O-R-D or some variation of that. That actually is trying to capture what we call the Tetragrammaton, which is the 4-letter name for God in Hebrew, Yud-He, Vav-He, which some people try to pronounce as Jehovah, Yahweh, however you want to break that up. The truth is that at some point there became a ban on actually pronouncing God's name, and the actual pronunciation of those letters became lost. So you have 4 letters that are all consonants that you don't know what the vowels actually are. The tradition was at one point that only the high priest would actually say God's name at the most holy day of the year. The problem is that tradition died out. So there are many different ideas behind what God's name is. The truth is we don't really know, and we use other things to actually pronounce God's name. Like you might hear a Jew say Hashem, which simply means the name, or Adonai, which means my Lord. But we generally stay away from trying to pronounce Yahweh, Yehovah, or probably not one of those anyways.
So I've seen that.
So what a lot of people do in order to avoid writing God's name is they'll write G-D, which is a tradition, but it's kind of a butchered tradition of not writing God's name because God's name isn't God.
Well, I've seen the Dead Sea Scrolls in Jerusalem, and you'll just see ... The Hebrew script actually stops.
I thought you were going to say something else, because in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, what you actually have is when you write God's name in Hebrew in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it'll switch to an ancient script, and it'll use gold leaf to write God's name. Ooh, okay. So it's doing the opposite. Not only should you not denigrate God's name by ever erasing it, but you should magnify God's name by every time you write it with gold leaf and in this ancient script. Paleo-Hebrew, as it's called. Paleo-Hebrew. It's a little bit more of like a pictographical Hebrew than the current script that you would see today.
So the interesting thing about this whole conversation is, for Christians, there's a little bit of a conundrum about the 10 Commandments, right? We tend to fall back on them or raise them up, but we're not sure if we just love each other, isn't everything okay? I just want to share a couple of scriptures with you that are interesting here. Matthew, Jesus says, "Think not that I have come to abolish the law. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Truly I tell you, till heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until it is all accomplished." How is the law accomplished? That's an interesting word. But anyway, so some would say, Jesus says, "Oh, you just love each other, we're okay," but that doesn't kind of say that. In John, he says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. It's a natural result, right? And later in John, he says, if you keep my commandments, you will abide in his love, just as I kept the Father's commandments and abide in his love. So that assumes that Jesus kept all the commandments, but Jesus didn't keep all the commandments. So, a very interesting text. And then,
by the way, I would tell you that even in rabbinic literature, healing on Shabbat, which Jesus got criticized for, is permissible. You're allowed to do anything on Shabbat that would enable you to save another human being's life or prevent the destruction of health that would cause the downfall of human life.
Well, see, so there you go.
Yeah.
So really interesting. We have about 15 minutes. I want to open up for questions a little bit.
I want to say one more thing, which I think is important. I kind of glossed over it a little bit. but it's the critical nature of why we call it the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances, and what commandment number 1 actually is. I, Adonai, am your God who led you out of Egypt to be your God. Not a commandment at all. It's an utterance. Yes, we can all agree on that. But why that utterance? And why is it so important? After all, it's utterance number 1. And it goes back to what we would actually call the tablets. We call them the Luchot HaBrit, the tablets of the covenant. And the covenant being the key word here. Utterance number 1 is really an invitation into the covenant. I am your God who brought you out of Egypt. In other words, we're establishing a covenant between me, God, and the people Israel right now. This is your invitation into the covenant, and these 10 utterances are the symbol of the covenant that we should establish. In the Jewish tradition, covenant is huge. By the way, some of you know that brit or bris in Hebrew means a covenant. It's the circumcision. We really do focus on entering our children into that covenant. I know in Christianity we have the New Covenant, and by the way, the Hebrew word for New Testament, if you go to Israel and you're like, oh, I need to pick up a copy of the New Testament in Hebrew, it's called Brit Chadashah. It's called the New Covenant, not the New Testament, if you're translating it literally. Because the idea of covenant is so central to the Jewish experience that what the commandments or the Aseret HaDibrot are really doing is they're becoming the establishment for the foundation of the covenant, both symbolically, probably more symbolically than literally, but I'd say that 10 symbolically is really helping you enter into that experience, especially utterance number 1.
Well, in our own tradition, where you have a baptism this coming Sunday, in the baptismal covenant, again, tying into the same thing with a bris or something like that idea of tying into the covenant is really the foundation of what baptism really means, too, for us. So same thing as a source of identity, a source of belonging, but inviting you into relationship with God. I think that's what the law, but the spirit underneath it, or the reason underneath it, is to build relationship with each other, but relationship with God.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely. Just out of curiosity, what else do you think is missing from this? And I'd say the one area where we agree is that I think we both feel that this should not be in classrooms throughout the United States, be it Jewish classrooms or Christian classrooms or particularly public schools. And I would also say we probably agree that they shouldn't be in courthouses either, because I don't think they're the symbol of modern jurisprudence, and I don't think they're really the symbol of morality in the modern context, even religious morality. But what do you think is like foundationally missing here, or so obviously just not there?
For me, they seem negative. It's like, where's the positive? I think of Micah. What does the Lord require to you but to do justice, love, kindness, walk humbly with your God? That could be it, right? That could be a commandment right there. The welcoming the stranger is obviously a theme. Hospitality, just itself, not even welcoming the stranger, but just is so foundational to that culture and that in our life together. So I think there's a lot actually here. It's like writing a mission statement. I don't know if you've been a part of a group or a committee or write it. And mission statements have the whole kitchen sink, but sometimes miss the main thing. The commandment to love. I mean, that's why for us, the idea of loving God and loving your neighbor really does, Jesus pinged that, but for us, it really does summarize what the hope is here. But, if you're worried about, because if I really love you, I'm not going to commit adultery, right? I'm not going to steal. I'm not going to kill. But
Mel Brooks kind of understood a lot of this fundamental conversation. I don't know if you've seen History of the World Part 1, and there's this famous scene, many of you have seen it. Mel Brooks is dressed up like Moses, and he comes down from Mount Sinai, and he's holding 3 tablets, and he says, "These are the 15," and one of the tablets drops and shatters. 10 commandments. And it brings up like a really thoughtful question, which is, what are the other 5 that could be on there that are missing? By the way, one of the commandments, if you make it out, because it's written in Hebrew, it says, "Lo titzchak," don't laugh. Very, very Mel Brooksy. But seriously, I think there he's pointing out that there's something that is just missing or incomplete, and we're not really getting the full story because we can't possibly be with these 10 limited series of laws that we have.
I think that's a fantastic question, and it'll open up a question. Can you say one thing before we go there, though, which is the "thou shalt not kill," which is the older translation.
Doesn't say that in Hebrew.
What does it say in Hebrew? Tell us.
Yeah, it says very clearly, lo tirtzach, which means you shall not murder. By the way, there's about 10 different words for kill in the Bible. Laharog, liktol, lahamit, lakot, and lirtzach means very specifically to murder. And it's a kind of forbidden killing in the context in which we would have today, because we could all imagine many different contexts where killing is necessary or permitted. So for example, if you go to war, obviously we're talking about a different set of values and laws and morals. Or there's a commandment that comes shortly afterwards that if someone is coming to kill you, you need to rise up and kill them before they kill you, and you have a responsibility. In a similar vein, if you actually see someone pursuing another individual and they're going to kill them, you have a responsibility to intervene at the cost of the pursuer as well, and you have a responsibility to kill them. Not only should you not kill them, you have to kill them in order to prevent the sin that is about to happen or the grievous crime that is about to happen. So we could unpack and go into the nuances and the nitty-gritty of each of these particular laws, like you shall not steal. We can write a whole book of laws simply on what does it mean to steal. It's not enough to give a broad commandment, lo tignov, you shall not steal, because there's simply far too much in here. Like, you shall not steal. But what if, we have a Jean Valjean situation, or what about corporate crime? Is that different than other crime?
Copyright for the thing we just sent to you. Okay, let's open it up a little bit. We have a few minutes here. Yes?
I have a question about the order in which this is written, these 10 commandments. Is there a reason for that? And the second question I have is for either one of you, what is the most significant one out of these 10?
So the first question was, what would the script that this is written in?
These 10 commandments have been written. Is there a reason for that? Why do you start with number 1 and not with number 5?
I'm not sure what the question is.
These are the orders that these different traditions have taken. One of the things you need to understand about the Bible, and Josh might elucidate more, but in the Western tradition, the numbering of verses and the way chapters are delineated and all that kind of stuff is a relatively new invention. It was not at the very, they didn't have, chapter 1, verse 2, 3, 4, the way we do today. Actually, that was an Archbishop of Canterbury. I got to give some English credit here, who did that, I think, in the 15th century. But my point is that some of these things evolved. We both started talking about liturgy. What you have to realize also, at least from the Christian tradition, a lot of the scriptures evolved to the way they are because of liturgical usage. In other words, people were doing this already, and then they wrote down the oral tradition, or they wrote down and so some of the orders come from custom and practice. So that doesn't really answer your question, but it's a little bit why they're vague. The difference, the striking thing here is the Catholic. I had no idea that the Catholic 10 Commandments were different than the Protestant 10 Commandments. All the stuff is in there. They just kind of clump them differently, right?
The second part of the question, which is the most important one? I'd say, I'd answer the question by kind of reframing it a little bit and ask, which is the most foundational? That's the way I'm going to interpret it. That is, which of the commandments really does morality, does other law really stem from, or does religiosity stem from? And I think it's the Jewish number 1. And that is, I am your God who led you out of Egypt to be your God. And the reason why I see that is because it is the invitation to enter into covenant with God, which is the foundation for observing the rest of Jewish law and Jewish practice.
And I would have responded the same way. One of the things you'll learn about Christians is that they often will interpret everything see everything through the lens of Jesus. So I think what Josh was just saying, if everything is seen through the lens of, I am the Lord your God, and everything flows out of that, right? So I think that's similar to us. I want to get to some other people too. We had a bunch of other questions. Yes, right here.
I think this is the law of unintended consequences. The fact that we have the Ten Commandments differently in Judaism or in Christianity is what the very Ten Commandments become the basis for people saying, why do I need religion? I follow those things without sectarian separations. So, in a way, it's good that we have them, and we who follow our particular religions know why we need our religion. But I find, and we see that in statistics around the world, where people are becoming less and less connected to particular institutions like religious, that they don't need it to be codified within
Yeah.
separate religion.
I would say that even if you take a basic commandment like love your neighbor as yourself, and someone says, oh, I do that, that's what makes me a good person, I don't need religion. That's your point, Elaine, right? Like, why do we need the rest of this stuff? I'd say those, and this too, even the commandments, are the bare minimum of entry. They're not like what you need to do in order to live a good life. They're what you need to do in order to begin to enter into a more deeply religious, spiritual, fulfilled life. But they're the bare minimum, not the maximum of what you should do.
I want to go back to that idea that the purpose is to build a relationship with you and with God and your neighbor. It's not just, like I said, checking off the list. Somebody else back there. I can't see. Go ahead.
Addressing issues of. So I'm not quite sure what you want to know about the application of. Sure. All right. I don't mean to do this to you, Jim, to shut down the question. I think it's a complex discussion that involves a lot of real discussion and maybe even its own class on the morality of war. So I don't think we can really get into that fully. But I'd say in terms of applicability, I don't think these laws are meant to exist simply symbolically alone. They're meant to actually be a part of how we live our lives. Yeah, so Jim's quoting Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who said when he marched in Selma, it was if he was praying with his feet. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and I think to that point, as you look through the scriptures right now in our lectionary, in our readings for Sunday, our readings from the Hebrew scriptures are focused on the lesser prophets, on Amos, and then next week is Hosea. And you read though, it's very clear that God is a God of love, but God is also a God of justice, right? And it's a little too easy to say, I'm going to love everybody. It sounds all warm and everything. But part of that love is justice and treating people fairly and that kind of thing. And, I think that's where you're getting a little bit. Who was over here? Sal, you had your hand up.
So a couple things. One of the things which you bring up, Sal, which is something we probably should have discussed, which is that the Ten Commandments don't just appear once in the Bible or in the Hebrew Bible. They appear both in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 6. And they don't appear exactly the same. They're more or less the same, but some of the language is a little bit nuanced and different. One of the pieces that's different is the commandment for Shabbat. In Exodus, it says, Shamor et Yom HaShabbat, observe Shabbat, and in Deuteronomy it says Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, remember Shabbat. And there are traditions around them, the fact that we have two candlesticks that we light Shabbat candles with. One of the ideas behind them is one represents observe and the other represents remember. And Shabbat is an act of both observing and remembering, and they get fused together. So that is a way that we've actually kind of brought both ideas from Deuteronomy and Exodus together in order to create a symbolic thing in Jewish practice of twos, of remembering and observing. We even have, in the prayer L'chadodi, Shamor v'zachor b'dibor echad. It's as if God said both observe and remember in one single utterance. So it's trying to fuse the different variations of the text.
So that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but in our communion service, Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. But the Greek word underneath that is amnesis. Amnesis is the opposite of amnesia. If amnesia is to forget, amnesis is to remember, right? But it actually means much more than that. This observe
I know that Greek
and
word.
remember. So that's a very interesting, because we've kind of dumbed it down to remember, but actually underneath it means twice as that. I love that, remember and observe, because it actually means make present. It actually it's bringing the past in, or the future into the right now, making it present. So that observe and remember, so that's fascinating.
But just to kind of answer the second part of your question, would the Pharisees have known about Shabbat, and would they have had a similar view as to modern Jewish practice today? I'd say yes, and we know that because rabbinic literature has a tractate called Tractate Shabbat, and it's the longest tractate in the entire Talmud. It was one of the most important pieces of Jewish observance that there actually was. But not only is it about what you cannot do, it's about how to observe Shabbat properly and the exceptions that you can make in order to actually ensure that life goes on during Shabbat and that life isn't jeopardized or threatened.
There's somebody over here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think what Jesus is trying to do, and several of the rabbis try to do it as well, is they're trying to figure out what is the fundamental law from which every other law springs. And there's a discussion about this in the Talmud, and one of the rabbis says the most fundamental law is that we're all created b'tzelem Elohim, we're all created in the image of God. And then there's a debate that says, it's not that, it's actually love your neighbor as yourself. So what they're really trying to determine is what are the laws from which the basis of most, if not all, other laws actually come out. I think that is what the rabbis are doing and what Jesus is doing. And what they end up saying is a story that's told in rabbinic literature about a guy who goes to the different rabbis to mock them and essentially says to them, teach me the entire Torah while I'm standing on one foot. Right? And the first rabbi is like, no, get out of here. You're being ridiculous and you're mocking our tradition. Second rabbi essentially says, love your neighbor as yourself. All the rest is commentary. Go and do it. And it's a similar kind of thing. It's not that it is the only thing. It is the foundational thing. And I think that might be where Jesus was going too, with if you're treating the stranger with dignity and respect, if you're doing kindness, if you're loving the other, the basis for religiosity will spring from that. Is my understanding.
I think that's great. Look, it's just about 12. I invite you to join us in Hoy Hall, which you go through this door to the right, and then you'll see it there.
There it is.
There is coffee and cake for you. We're going to continue next week on Adam and Eve and creation, and we'll have fun with that. Next week is here, same time, same place, and then the week after that we go to the Jewish Center of the Hamptons. I want to say thank you, Josh.
Thank you,
Thank
Ben.
you for being here.